Ruth, the story of faith, one book at a time. Ruth is a small book, but it carries a powerful place in the story of faith. If we only remember Ruth as a beautiful love story, we will miss how much this little book is doing in the larger story of Scripture. Because Ruth does not open during a season of spiritual strength. It opens in the days when the judges ruled. And that matters. Judges showed us a painful downward spiral. Again and again, God's people turned away from him. Again and again, they needed rescue. And by the end of Judges, the repeated summary was heartbreaking. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Then Ruth opens in that same period. But instead of showing us another scene of violence, idolatry, and collapse, Ruth lets us see something else. Even in dark days, faithfulness had not disappeared from the land. Naomi was grieving, but returning. Ruth was an outsider, pledging herself to Naomi's people and Naomi's God. Boaz was a righteous man, willing to bear the cost of redemption. And above them all, the faithful God was working through ordinary people, ordinary fields, and ordinary decisions to move his promise forward. This is the story of faith, one book at a time. And today we are walking through the book of Ruth. Ruth matters because it reminds us that God does not need the wealthiest, strongest, smartest, most powerful, or most impressive people to accomplish his purposes. His power to save comes from his own strength, his own faithfulness, and his own promise. In the days when many in Israel were doing what was right in their own eyes, a Moabite woman did what was right in God's eyes. She laid down the life she knew. She clung to Naomi. She embraced Naomi's people. She pledged herself to Naomi's God. And through her, God carried forward a promise that would lead to David and eventually to King Jesus. So before we rush through Ruth because it is short, we need to slow down and see what God is showing us. Ruth is a short Old Testament narrative set during the time of the Judges. It begins in Bethlehem during a famine, moves to the land of Moab, and then returns to Bethlehem, where the heart of the story unfolds. The book does not name its author. Jewish tradition has often associated it with Samuel, though the book itself does not tell us who wrote it. The exact date of writing is debated, but the story itself is set before Israel had a king during the days of the Judges. The main people in the book are Naomi, Ruth, Boaz, the unnamed nearer redeemer, and the child born at the end of the story, Obed. That child becomes the father of Jesse, and Jesse becomes the father of David. So from the beginning, we need to understand that Ruth is not just a private family story. It becomes part of the royal line. It becomes part of the movement toward David. And because David's line leads us to Jesus, Ruth also becomes part of the story that leads to the true king. Ruth is often remembered as a love story, and there is real beauty in the relationship between Ruth and Boaz. But Ruth is much more than romance. It is a story of grief, loyalty, providence, land, inheritance, family name, costly redemption, and God's work in history. To understand Ruth well, we need to see the vulnerability of Naomi and Ruth. Naomi's husband, Elimelech, had been from Bethlehem in Judah. His family had an inheritance connected to the land. But after famine, death, and years away in Moab, Naomi returned without her husband and without her sons. That means her crisis was not only emotional, it was also social and economic. It was tied to family future, covenant land, and the preservation of a name. Her family's future was in jeopardy. Her husband's name and inheritance were at risk of fading away. That is why redemption matters so much in this book. In Israel's law, land was not merely property in the modern sense. It was connected to family, inheritance, covenant life, and future generations. When a family fell into poverty or crisis, a near relative could act as redeemer. He could step in to recover what was in danger, preserve the family name, and protect the future of the vulnerable. That background helps us see Boaz more clearly. Boaz is not merely being kind. He is stepping into the role of redeemer. And redemption costs something. Now, where does Ruth fit in the larger story? Ruth belongs right after Judges, and that placement helps us feel its weight. Judges shows Israel's need for righteous rule. The people have the land, but they are not living faithfully under God's rule. The covenant people keep collapsing into cycles of sin, oppression, crying out, rescue, and return to rebellion. Ruth begins in that same world. But it does not show us a judge leading armies. It does not show us a national deliverance. It does not show us fire from heaven. waters parting, walls falling, or a prophet thundering in the public square. Instead, Ruth shows us widows walking a road, a foreign woman gleaning in a field, a righteous man protecting the vulnerable, a city gate where redemption is publicly settled, and a baby placed in Naomi's arms. In human eyes, these may look like small things, but God is using them to move the story toward David. That is one of the beauties of Ruth. It lets us peek behind the curtain and see that God was not content to let the downward spiral continue forever. While Israel's public life was often marked by disorder, God was preserving the line through which Israel's king would come. And that kingly line would eventually lead beyond David to Jesus, the son of David, the true king. Ruth also reminds us that Abraham's promise was never meant to stop with Israel alone. God had promised Abraham that all the families of the earth would be blessed through his offspring. And here Ruth, a Moabite woman, is brought into the covenant story and into the family line of David. That is not a small detail, it is a signpost in the story. God's purpose was always larger than one ethnic boundary, one family, or one moment in history. Through Israel, blessing would reach the nations. And in Ruth, one woman from the nations is welcomed into the story that will eventually bring blessing to the world through King Jesus. Now let's walk through what happens in the book. Ruth begins with famine in Bethlehem. That is already striking because Bethlehem means house of bread, yet the house of bread has no bread. Elimelech takes his wife, Naomi, and their 2 sons to the land of Moab. While they are there, Naomi's husband dies. Her sons marry Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. Then, after about 10 years, both sons die as well. Naomi is left in Moab without husband, sons, or grandchildren. When she hears that the Lord has visited his people and given them food, Naomi decides to return to Bethlehem. She urges Orpah and Ruth to go back to their own people. Orpah eventually returns, but Ruth clings to Naomi. And Ruth's words are some of the most memorable in Scripture. But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." Ruth chapter 1, verse 16. This is more than affection for Naomi. Ruth is leaving Moab behind. She is leaving the life she knew. She is binding herself to Naomi's future, Naomi's people, and Naomi's God. When Naomi returns to Bethlehem, the town is stirred, but Naomi is not ready to call herself blessed. She says, "I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty." Ruth chapter 1, verse 21. That is how Naomi sees her life, empty. Her husband is gone, her sons are gone, her future seems gone, her family line is threatened, her inheritance is in jeopardy. She has returned home, but she feels as though the story has ended. But Naomi cannot see what God is already doing, and that is one of the great tensions in Ruth. Naomi can see what she lost, but she cannot yet see what God is preparing. The next movement of the book takes us into the fields. Ruth goes out to glean so she and Naomi can eat. Gleaning was one of the ways God's law provided for the poor, the widow, the sojourner, and the vulnerable. Landowners were to leave some of the harvest for those in need. So Ruth goes to glean, and the text tells us that she happened to come to the field of Boaz. From Ruth's point of view, it may have seemed like an ordinary field, but the reader is allowed to see more. Boaz is a worthy man. He is also from the clan of Elimelech. He notices Ruth, protects her, provides for her, and honors the loyalty she has shown to Naomi. He knows she has taken refuge under the wings of the Lord, the God of Israel. As the story continues, Naomi realizes that Boaz is a close relative, one who may be able to redeem the family's inheritance. Ruth goes to Boaz at the threshing floor, not in seduction, but in a humble appeal for covenant protection and redemption. Boaz responds with honor. He does not exploit Ruth's vulnerability. He does not act secretly or selfishly. He agrees to pursue redemption properly. But there is another man who has the first right of redemption. So at the city gate, Boaz presents the matter publicly. At first, the nearer redeemer is willing to redeem the land. But when he learns that redeeming the land also means taking responsibility for Ruth the Moabite and preserving the name of the dead, he refuses. He is willing when redemption appears to benefit him. He steps back when redemption becomes costly. Boaz does what the other man will not do. He redeems the inheritance. He takes Ruth as his wife. He preserves the family name. and he acts with public righteousness and selfless faithfulness. Then the Lord gives Ruth a son. His name is Obed. The women of Bethlehem speak blessing over Naomi, and the child becomes a restorer of life to her. The book that began with famine, death, and emptiness ends with birth, restoration, and hope. Then Ruth gives us the genealogy. Obed fathered Jesse. Jesse fathered David. That is where the book lands. Not merely with Ruth and Boaz, not merely with Naomi comforted, but with David on the horizon. Now, as we read Ruth, there are several major themes to watch. One major theme is God's quiet providence. God is not absent because he is not obvious. Ruth shows us the God who works behind the scenes, not because his power is small, but because his wisdom is deeper than what people can see in the moment. Naomi sees emptiness, but God is preparing restoration. Ruth sees a field, but God is leading her to Boaz. Boaz sees a family responsibility, but God is preserving the line of David. Another major theme is faith as allegiance. Ruth's faith is not presented as bare belief or private feeling. It is embodied in loyalty, leaving, clinging, serving, trusting, and identifying herself with Naomi's people and Naomi's God. She does not merely admire Israel's God from a distance, she pledges herself to him. And that is a powerful contrast with Judges. Many in Israel had covenant privilege, but resisted God's rule. Ruth had no covenant privilege by birth, yet she embraced the God of Israel with costly loyalty. A third theme is redemption. Boaz shows us that redemption is not sentimental. The nearer Redeemer refuses because he does not want to endanger his own inheritance. Boaz steps forward and bears the cost. He restores what Naomi and Ruth cannot restore for themselves. He protects the vulnerable. He preserves the family name. He secures the inheritance. A fourth theme is the outsider welcomed into the promise. Ruth is repeatedly called a Moabite. The book does not want us to forget where she came from. She is not the person many would expect to find in the family line of Israel's great king. But God's grace is not limited by human expectations. Ruth is brought into the people of God. She becomes the great-grandmother of David, and through David's line, the promise continues toward Christ. A final theme is God's strength working through human weakness. Ruth is not a story about powerful people controlling history. It is a story about widows, poverty, gleaning, risk, kindness, covenant faithfulness, and a redeemer at the city gate. God is not limited by what looks small to us. He can carry mighty purposes through ordinary faithfulness. That is why Ruth chapter 1 verse 16 is such a fitting key verse for this book. Listen again to Ruth's words. Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Ruth chapter 1 verse 16. This verse captures the heart of Ruth's response. She is not simply choosing Naomi as a travel companion. She is leaving Moab and joining herself to Naomi's people and Naomi's God. Her words show loyalty, trust, allegiance, and surrender. Against the backdrop of Israel's covenant confusion, Ruth's allegiance shines brightly. She leaves behind the life she knew and entrusts herself to the God of Israel. And God takes this Moabite widow and weaves her into the line of the king. So how does Ruth point us to King Jesus? It points to him in several important ways. First, Ruth points to Jesus through David. The book ends with David's genealogy. That means Ruth is not only looking backward at the time of the Judges, it is also looking forward to the king. God is moving the story from the chaos of Judges toward the house of David. And the New Testament begins by showing us that Jesus is the son of David. Second, Ruth points to Jesus through redemption. Boaz is not Jesus, and we should not force every detail of the story into an allegory, but Boaz does give us a beautiful picture of costly redemption. He is near enough to redeem. He is willing to redeem. He bears the cost another man refuses to bear. That helps us understand why Jesus came near to us. The eternal Son did not redeem us while remaining at a distance. He took on flesh and blood. He entered our human family. He came as the true Redeemer, able and willing to do what we could never do for ourselves. Boaz redeemed land, name, and family inheritance. Jesus redeems sinners, restores us to God, and secures an inheritance we could never recover for ourselves. Third, Ruth points to Jesus through the inclusion of the nations. Ruth is a Moabite, yet she is brought into Israel and into the line of David. This does not erase Israel's role in the story. It shows the larger purpose God had promised from the beginning. Through Abraham's offspring, blessing would come to the nations. In Jesus, that promise reaches its fulfillment. The king who comes from Israel also gathers people from every nation into his kingdom. Finally, Ruth points to Jesus through Bethlehem. Ruth returns with Naomi to Bethlehem. Boaz redeems in Bethlehem. Obed is born into this Bethlehem story. David's line is preserved through Bethlehem. And later, in Bethlehem, the greater son of David will be born. Ruth does not tell us the whole story, but it carries the line that leads us there. So how should we read Ruth well? First, read Ruth as more than a love story. There is love in Ruth, but the book is not merely about finding a spouse or waiting for a Boaz. If we reduce Ruth to romance, we will miss its deeper place in the story of faith. Read it as a story of covenant loyalty, providence, redemption, and hope. Second, read Ruth in light of Judges. The opening words matter. Ruth takes place in the days when the judges ruled. That means this story of faithfulness is set against a backdrop of covenant instability. Ruth shows us that even when the larger culture is spiritually confused, God can still preserve faithfulness in ordinary homes, ordinary fields, and ordinary acts of obedience. Third, read Ruth with attention to land and inheritance. Naomi's crisis is not only emotional, it is also tied to family future, covenant land, and the preservation of a name. That is why Boaz's redemption matters. He does not merely offer Ruth and Naomi charity. He steps into their danger and secures what they could not secure for themselves. And finally, read Ruth with patience. Ruth is not loud. It does not move by spectacle. It moves quietly. But that is part of its beauty. It teaches us to recognize God's hand not only in the dramatic moments, but also in the hidden ones. Sometimes providence looks like a field. Sometimes mercy looks like leftover grain. Sometimes redemption looks like a righteous man willing to bear a cost. Sometimes the future of the kingdom begins in places that seem small to everyone except God. So what do we carry with us from Ruth? First, Ruth teaches us that God may be working most deeply when we can see the least clearly. Naomi thought she had returned empty. She could not yet see Obed. She could not see Jesse. She could not see David. She could not see Bethlehem's greater son who would come generations later. She could only see what she had lost. And we understand that. There are seasons when loss becomes the lens through which we interpret everything. We look at what is gone, what failed, what died, what cannot be recovered, and we wonder if the story has ended. Ruth reminds us that our vision is limited, but God's faithfulness is not. Second, Ruth teaches us that faith is allegiance that takes visible form. Ruth's faith was not merely something she felt inside. It moved her feet. It changed her future. It reshaped her identity. She left Moab and bound herself to Naomi, Naomi's people, and Naomi's God. That kind of faith still matters. Faith is not merely agreeing that God exists. It is trusting Him, pledging ourselves to Him, and walking under His rule even when the path ahead is uncertain. Third, Ruth teaches us that redemption is costly. Boaz did what the nearer Redeemer refused to do. He accepted responsibility, protected the vulnerable, and restored what was in danger of being lost. And that prepares our hearts to see Jesus more clearly. Our Redeemer did not come because redemption was easy. He came because we could not save ourselves. He took on our humanity. He bore the cost. He gave Himself so that we could be restored to God and receive an inheritance we could never secure on our own. Finally, Ruth teaches us that God does not need impressive circumstances to accomplish His purposes. He worked through a grieving widow, a Moabite woman, gleaning in a field, a righteous man at a city gate, and a child born in Bethlehem. And through all of it, He carried the promise forward. Ruth may be a small book, but it opens a wide window into the faithfulness of God. If you would like the written companion overview, including the summary, major themes, key verse, and takeaways, you can find the Facebook post for this installment on the Tuesdays with Tony page. As we sit with Ruth today, maybe the question is not whether God is working only when His work looks dramatic, but whether we can trust Him when His work looks small, hidden, and ordinary. Naomi saw emptiness. Ruth stepped forward in loyalty. Boaz acted as a faithful redeemer, and God was carrying His promise toward David, toward Bethlehem, and toward King Jesus. If you're willing, share your reflections or questions in the comments so we can learn and walk this journey together.